Picture this nightmare. It's a peaceful morning in ancient Sparta. A woman named Alexia tends to her garden, humming softly as she waits for news from the battlefield where her husband fights for Spartan glory. She's prepared for two possibilities: his triumphant return or news of his honourable death. But she never imagined the third option, the one that would make her beg for death itself. The pounding on her door isn't gentle. It's violent, urgent, terrifying. 3 Spartan officials stand in her doorway, their faces carved from stone. "Your husband fled the battlefield," one announces, his voice cutting through her world like a blade. "He chose cowardice over death. He chose shame over honor." The words hang in the air like poison. Now you must pay the price. In that single moment, Alexia's life doesn't just change, it ends. Everything she was, everything she hoped to become, dies in that doorway. But her body? Her body is forced to keep living, breathing, suffering through what comes next. What happens next is so twisted, so psychologically devastating, that modern torture experts study Spartan methods to understand the limits of human cruelty. Because the Spartans didn't just punish failure, they weaponized shame itself, turning human suffering into a precise science of psychological warfare. Within hours of that announcement, Alexia's name becomes a curse word, whispered in the streets. Her neighbors, who shared bread with her family just yesterday, now cross the street to avoid her contaminating presence. Her closest friend spits at her feet and declares she never knew her. Children who played with her sons now throw rocks at them while screaming, "Coward's blood! Coward's blood!" But this social annihilation is just the appetizer. The Spartans had perfected a systematic approach to human destruction that would unfold over months, years, decades. They had discovered something more powerful than the fear of death, the fear of a life not worth living. The genius of Spartan cruelty lay in its patience. They didn't kill these women quickly. They didn't even drive them insane. Instead, they crafted a form of torture so sophisticated that it required the victims to remain fully conscious, fully aware, fully human, while being systematically stripped of everything that made life bearable. Alexia's transformation from respected citizen to living ghost happened overnight. The respect she had earned through years of supporting Spartan society evaporated like morning mist. The love of her community turned to contempt so profound that many historians argue death would have been a mercy. Her children looked at her with confusion, then fear, then shame as they began to understand that their mother had become something unspeakable in Spartan society. The official ceremony of degradation would come later, but the psychological assault began immediately. Alexia's house was marked with symbols of shame. Her family's possessions were inventoried by officials who treated her belongings like contaminated objects. Her servants fled, fearing that association with the tainted would spread the contagion of dishonor to their own families. As night fell on that first day, Alexia sat in her empty house, surrounded by the remnants of her former life. She could hear the celebrations in the distance. other families welcoming home their victorious warriors. The sound of joy felt like knives in her heart. She understood now that she inhabited a world where survival was not victory, but the cruelest punishment of all. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new humiliations, new ways to suffer. But tonight, in the darkness of her destroyed life, Alexia made a terrible discovery. Even in her deepest despair, even in her most profound shame, she still wanted to live, and the Spartans were counting on exactly that. If you think being ostracized was the worst part of this nightmare, you're not even close to understanding the depths of Spartan cruelty. What came next was a masterclass in psychological torture that would make modern interrogators weep at its sophistication. The public ceremony of shame was scheduled for exactly 7 days after the initial announcement. This wasn't random timing. The Spartans understood that a week was just long enough for hope to die, but not long enough for acceptance to set in. They wanted their victims trapped in that excruciating space between despair and resignation. Alexia was dragged, not escorted, dragged to the central agora where the entire population of Sparta had gathered. This wasn't just a punishment, it was theatre, performance art designed to terrorize an entire society into absolute obedience. The crowd wasn't forced to attend. They came eagerly, hungry for the spectacle of someone else's destruction. The Ephors, Sparta's ruling council, read the charges against her husband in excruciating detail. Every moment of his cowardice was dissected, analyzed, and presented to the mob like evidence in a trial. But Alexia wasn't on trial. She was already condemned. The reading was pure cruelty, designed to engrave her husband's failure into her soul so deeply that she could never forget, never heal, never move forward. Then came the stripping, not just of clothes, though that happened too. They stripped away her legal identity, her citizenship, her right to own property, her right to speak in public, her right to participate in religious ceremonies. Each right was announced as it was removed, the crowd cheering with each new humiliation. But the Spartans had saved their cruelest innovation for last, the ceremony of living death. Alexia was forced to speak her own eulogy, declaring herself dead to Spartan society while standing very much alive before the jeering crowd. She had to renounce her husband, declare him a coward, and beg the state for permission to continue existing in their city. The psychological brilliance of this ritual was staggering. And they forced her to participate in her own destruction, making her complicit in the very system that was annihilating her. She couldn't claim victimhood because she had spoken the words herself. She couldn't resist because she had already surrendered. They had turned her into a weapon against herself. The crowd was encouraged to participate. Citizens threw rotten food, excrement, and stones. But worse than the physical assault was the emotional brutality. These weren't strangers. These were people who had known her, celebrated with her, shared their lives with her. Their hatred wasn't abstract. It was personal, intimate, devastating. After the ceremony, Alexia was given new clothes, rough, undyed cloth that immediately marked her status to anyone who saw her. She was assigned new living quarters in the worst part of the city among the Helots and Piraeae. Her former home was given to a deserving warrior's family, erasing even the physical spaces where her happiness had lived. The temporal restrictions began immediately. She could only appear in public during certain hours, typically the least desirable times when the agora was empty and cold. She had to take specific routes through the city, avoiding main thoroughfares and places of honor. She couldn't enter temples, couldn't shop at regular markets, couldn't even draw water from communal wells during peak hours. But perhaps the most diabolical aspect of this systematic destruction was the hope. The Spartans dangled the possibility of redemption just out of reach, like a carrot before a starving donkey. If her sons proved themselves exceptional warriors, if they died gloriously in battle, then maybe some of her shame could be lifted. This false hope was more torturous than despair, because it kept her emotionally invested in the very system that had destroyed her. The genius of Spartan cruelty wasn't its intensity, it was its sustainability. They had created a form of torture that could last for decades, that required minimal resources to maintain, and that actually strengthened their military culture by terrifying everyone else into absolute obedience. Alexia's transformation was complete. She had become exactly what the Spartans intended, a living warning, a cautionary tale made flesh, a reminder of what happened to those who dared to fail the state. And the most horrifying part? This was still just the beginning. Now we enter the darkest chapter of this nightmare, a realm of sexual horror so disturbing that ancient historians often wrote about it in coded language, too horrified to describe the full truth. What the Spartans did to these women's bodies and sexuality represents some of the most sophisticated sexual torture ever documented. 3 months after her public degradation, Alexia received another visit from Spartan officials. But this time, they weren't alone. Behind them stood Marcus, a decorated warrior fresh from victorious campaigns, his armor still bearing the stains of enemy blood. The official's announcement was brief and brutal. You will marry this warrior, you will bear his children. You will be grateful for his mercy in accepting damaged goods. This wasn't marriage. It was state-sanctioned rape with paperwork. Alexia had no choice, no voice, no right to refuse. Her body was simply being transferred from one owner to another, like a piece of military equipment being redistributed to more deserving hands. The twisted genius of this system was its pretense of legitimacy. By calling it marriage, the Spartans could avoid the moral complications of openly endorsing rape. By framing it as mercy, they could claim they were helping these women rather than exploiting them. So, the psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as it was cruel. Marcus was given explicit instructions about his new wife. He was to treat her as a breeding animal, not a partner. Her pleasure was irrelevant, her consent was assumed through the state's authority. She was to produce children, specifically sons, who would redeem her bloodline through military service. If she failed to conceive, or if she produced only daughters, she could be returned to the state like defective merchandise. The sexual dynamics of these forced unions were carefully calculated to maximize psychological damage. Marcus was encouraged to remind Alexia constantly of her inferior status. During intimate moments, he would describe in graphic detail how much better she was than her coward husband, how grateful she should be for his attention, how her body now belonged to a real warrior. But the cruelest aspect of these arrangements was the children. Every pregnancy became a twisted lottery. Sons might redeem her shame, but they would also be taken from her at age 7 for military training, where they would be taught to despise their mother's bloodline. Daughters would inherit her shame, doomed to lives as outcasts in a society that valued women primarily for their ability to produce warriors. Alexia's first pregnancy with Marcus was a nightmare of conflicted emotions. She hoped for a son who might restore her family's honor, but she feared what that redemption would cost. She dreaded bearing a child for the man who treated her like livestock, but she knew that failure to conceive would bring even worse punishments. The birth was attended by Spartan officials who evaluated the infant like livestock judges at a market. The baby was a boy, healthy, strong, seemingly perfect Spartan material. The officials nodded approvingly and made notes in their records. Alexia was permitted a brief moment of relief before the brutal reality set in. This child would be raised to see her shame as his greatest enemy. The sexual exploitation extended beyond the primary forced marriage. Successful warriors could claim temporary access to these women as rewards for exceptional service. Alexia might be loaned out to visiting dignitaries, given as prizes in military competitions, or used to seal diplomatic agreements with foreign powers. These temporary arrangements were presented as honors. The women should be grateful that their bodies were considered valuable enough to serve the state's interests. The psychological manipulation was staggering. They were trained to feel shame for being victims and gratitude for being exploited. The contraception and pregnancy control exercised by the state was another layer of sexual torture. These women weren't allowed to make any decisions about their own reproductive lives. The state determined when they should conceive, with whom, and how many children they should bear. Herbs that could prevent pregnancy were forbidden. Attempts at abortion were punishable by death. Some women tried to resist through subtle sabotage, making themselves less appealing, feigning illness, or finding ways to avoid conception. But the Spartans had anticipated this resistance and developed countermeasures that were both sophisticated and brutal. The most psychologically devastating aspect of this sexual slavery was its permanence. Unlike other forms of torture that eventually ended, this exploitation could continue for decades. A woman like Alexia might be passed between multiple warriors throughout her fertile years, bearing children for men who despised her, raising sons who would be taught to be ashamed of her existence. And through it all, the pretense of marriage was maintained. These women were expected to play the role of grateful wives, loving mothers, and devoted servants to the state. Their suffering was hidden behind a facade of domestic normalcy that made their isolation complete and their resistance impossible. If the torture of innocent women wasn't horrifying enough, the systematic destruction of their children represents perhaps the most evil aspect of Spartan society. These children, guilty of nothing more than existing, were condemned to lives of unimaginable suffering, designed to either break them completely or forge them into weapons against their own families. Alexia's son, Leonidas, was 7 years old when the Spartan officials came to take him to the agoge. But this wasn't the same military training that other Spartan boys experienced. This was something far more sinister. A specialized program designed specifically for the sons of cowards, a hell within a hell that would either kill him or transform him into a weapon against everything he had once loved. From the moment he arrived at the training camp, Leonidas was marked. While other boys were organized into units based on age and ability, the sons of cowards were isolated into special groups. They were given the worst quarters, the least food, and the most dangerous assignments. But the physical deprivation was nothing compared to the psychological warfare that began immediately. The instructors had a specific curriculum for these boys. Every day began with a recitation of their father's cowardice. They were forced to memorize the details of the defeat, to understand exactly how their bloodline had failed Sparta, and to acknowledge their inherited shame. They had to denounce their fathers publicly, calling them cowards and traitors, begging for the chance to prove they were different. The other boys were encouraged to torment them. It wasn't random bullying, it was systematic, organized, and sanctioned by the state. The sons of heroes were taught that abusing the sons of cowards was a civic duty, a way of demonstrating their own superiority and loyalty to Spartan values. Leonidas learned quickly that survival required him to become someone else entirely. He had to reject everything about his mother, his family, his past. He had to become the most brutal, the most aggressive, the most willing to inflict pain on others. Only by proving he could be crueler than anyone else could he earn even basic acceptance. The sexual abuse these boys endured was systematic and horrific. Older boys and instructors used them as outlets for dominance and aggression. But this wasn't random violence. It was calculated to break their spirits and rebuild them. According to Spartan specifications, they were taught that their bodies, like their mothers' bodies, belonged to the state, to be used as the state saw fit. The training exercises designed for these boys were beyond brutal. While regular students faced dangerous challenges, the sons of cowards were given impossible tasks designed to maximize casualties. They were sent on night missions that were essentially suicide runs, forced to fight against overwhelming odds and abandoned in wilderness areas with no supplies or support. Many didn't survive. The mortality rate among sons of cowards was estimated to be 3 times higher than among regular trainees. But those deaths weren't seen as tragedies. They were viewed as natural selection, the weak bloodlines eliminating themselves to preserve Spartan purity. For the daughters, the horror was different but equally devastating. Alexia's daughter, Cassandra, faced a future with no possibilities for happiness or dignity. No respectable Spartan would marry her, dooming her to a life as an outcast or, worse, as property to be traded among the lower classes. Cassandra was excluded from the physical training and social activities that normally prepared Spartan girls for their roles as mothers of warriors. She couldn't participate in religious dances, athletic competitions, or social gatherings. She was barred from festivals, forbidden from temples, and denied access to the cultural education that would normally be her birthright. The marriage prospects for these girls were essentially non-existent within Spartan society. Some were sold to foreign masters as slaves, others were given to healers as rewards for good service, and the unlucky ones were kept as breeding stock for experimental programs designed to see if cowardice could be bred out through superior paternal genetics. The psychological impact on these children was catastrophic and permanent. They grew up knowing that their very existence was seen as a contamination, that their blood carried a poison that could none be cleansed. They learned that love was weakness, that family was liability, and that their only hope for acceptance lay in the complete destruction of everything they had once cherished. Some children broke under the pressure, fulfilling the Spartan prophecy of inherited cowardice through suicide or flight. Others became monsters, embracing cruelty with such enthusiasm that they surpassed even their tormentors. A rare few found ways to resist internally while maintaining the appearance of compliance, but the psychological cost of this double life was immense. The long-term consequences were exactly what the Spartans intended. These children grew up to be adults who were either broken tools of the state or dangerous enemies of human compassion. They carried forward the trauma they had experienced, often becoming the most enthusiastic enforcers of the very system that had destroyed their childhoods. The genius of this generational torture was its self-perpetuation. Each generation of traumatized children grew up to become adults who would traumatize the next generation. The cycle of cruelty became embedded in Spartan culture so deeply that it seemed natural, inevitable, and necessary for military supremacy. As we reach the climax of this horrific story, we discover that the Spartans' systematic cruelty contained the seeds of their own destruction. The empire built on the suffering of innocent women and children would ultimately collapse under the weight of its own inhumanity, but not before creating horrors that would echo through history as warnings about the price of placing power over compassion. By the 4th century BCE, The demographic consequences of Sparta's brutal system have become undeniable. The population of full Spartan citizens had collapsed catastrophically, from perhaps 8,000 adult males at Sparta's height to fewer than 1,000 by the time of Macedonian conquest. Every family destroyed, every woman driven to despair, every child lost to suicide or exile represented a hemorrhage in the Spartan population that proved impossible to stop. The economic costs were equally devastating. The constant punishment and redistribution of property from disgraced families created massive inefficiencies in Spartan agriculture and trade. Land that had been productive for generations was abandoned or mismanaged when transferred to politically reliable but incompetent recipients. The economic foundation of Spartan military power slowly crumbled as the productive class was systematically eliminated. But perhaps most tragically, the moral corruption of Spartan society had reached levels that made effective military cooperation impossible. Warriors who had grown up in a system that rewarded cruelty over competence, who had learned to see fellow citizens as enemies to be destroyed rather than comrades to be protected, proved incapable of the unity and trust that effective military units required. The psychological damage extended even to the children of successful warriors. Growing up in a society where love was conditional, where family bonds could be severed overnight, where human worth was measured solely by military performance, created a generation of Spartans who were psychologically incapable of the deep social bonds that had once made their military formations invincible. Foreign observers began to notice the change. Diplomatic missions to Sparta reported a society in the grip of mass paranoia, where citizens lived in constant fear of being associated with failure, where innovation was stifled by terror of making mistakes, where the legendary Spartan discipline had devolved into mindless brutality. The military effectiveness that had once made Sparta the terror of Greece began to deteriorate as the human cost of their system became unsustainable. Warriors who had been trained to see compassion as weakness, who had learned to destroy rather than protect, proved increasingly ineffective against enemies who fought for something they loved rather than something they feared. The final irony was that Sparta's enemies learned to exploit their cruelty against them. Foreign armies discovered that capturing Spartan warriors alive, rather than killing them in battle, could inflict more damage on Spartan society than any military defeat. Each captured warrior meant another family destroyed, another group of women and children condemned to lives of torture, another hemorrhage in the already declining Spartan population. The resistance movements that eventually emerged from within Sparta came primarily from the families of the disgraced, people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from the destruction of the system that had destroyed them. These internal enemies created by Spartan cruelty proved more dangerous to the state than any foreign army. When Sparta finally fell, it wasn't in a glorious last stand worthy of their legendary reputation. It was a slow, pathetic collapse as a society that had consumed its own humanity finally ran out of people willing or able to sustain it. The warriors who remained were too few, too damaged, and too isolated to defend against enemies who fought with the unity and purpose that Sparta had systematically destroyed within itself. The archaeological evidence tells the final chapter of this story. Spartan burial sites from the later periods show clear evidence of malnutrition, violence, and social breakdown. The graves of the final generation reveal a society in demographic free fall, with high infant mortality, widespread disease, and social structures that had completely collapsed. Today, as we uncover these buried histories and examine the ruins of Spartan civilization, we can see clearly what their contemporaries could not. That the systematic torture of innocent women and children wasn't a sign of strength, but a symptom of a society already dying from moral rot. The wives of defeated Spartan warriors, women like Alexia, whose names were erased from history, but whose suffering echoes across the centuries, stand as eternal witnesses to a simple truth, that any civilization which sacrifices its most vulnerable members on the altar of military glory will ultimately find itself too weak to survive. Their story is not just a tale of ancient cruelty, it's a warning that remains relevant today. In a world where power still corrupts, where fear still drives policy, where the vulnerable still suffer for the failures of the powerful, the screams of